Okay, so this is the story nobody in mainstream coverage is really connecting the dots on yet, and I think it's actually the single most important development in this entire conflict so far. Forget the target counts for a second. Forget the ship traffic numbers. There's one weapon system that just got used again, and if you understand what it actually does, you'll understand why Iran's entire missile strategy has quietly become obsolete over the last few weeks. We're talking about the deep-penetrator bunker buster that just made its return appearance over a mountain complex south of Isfahan, and the footage coming out of that strike is honestly some of the wildest secondary explosion footage I've seen out of this entire war. A mountain that's supposed to be one of the most hardened, most protected pieces of real estate Iran owns just lit up from the inside like someone dropped a lit match into a fireworks warehouse. So tonight we're doing a deep dive. What this weapon actually is, why it exists, why it's specifically built to solve the exact problem Iran spent 40 years trying to prevent, and what it means strategically now that it's clearly back in active rotation. Stick around through the whole thing, because in the back half, we're getting into the roundup and a strategic read on where this fits into the bigger picture, and there's a piece near the end about autonomous systems getting folded into this fight that I think is going to matter a lot more a year from now than it seems right now. Let's start with the problem this weapon was actually built to solve, because you can't appreciate why it matters without understanding what it's up against. For decades, Iran's approach to protecting its missile program has been almost entirely about depth and concealment rather than active defense. Instead of trying to shoot down every incoming bomb, which is expensive, unreliable, and gives away your position the moment you try, the strategy has been to bury everything so deep inside solid rock that a conventional bomb simply can't physically reach it. Missile production lines, assembly facilities, long-term storage, all of it tunneled into mountainsides, behind reinforced concrete, under enough overhead rock that older generations of bunker-busting munitions would detonate on the surface, or just short of the actual target, doing plenty of damage to the entrance and the outer structure, while leaving the deep interior completely untouched. And for a long time, that strategy actually worked reasonably well. You'd see strikes hit these facilities, you'd see impressive footage of explosions at entrances and support structures, and then within days or weeks, missiles would start rolling back out of the same mountain like nothing had happened. That's not incompetence on the part of whoever was planning those earlier strikes. That's the entire point of building this deep in the first place. You're not trying to survive a hit. You're trying to make sure the hit never actually reaches the part of the facility that matters. It's worth appreciating just how much investment went into building this kind of infrastructure in the first place, because it wasn't a rushed wartime improvisation. This is the product of roughly 4 decades of continuous construction and engineering effort, developed under sanctions, under intermittent inspection pressure, under constant scrutiny from foreign intelligence services, and it was built specifically with the assumption that a future conflict with a technologically superior adversary was not just possible, but likely. Every choice in that construction process, how deep to dig, how thick to pour the reinforced concrete, how many separate entrances and internal chambers to build to prevent a single strike from collapsing the whole system, was made with that eventual conflict already priced in. In a real sense, what we're watching play out right now is a test of an engineering assumption that's been sitting untested for most of those 4 decades. And what's becoming clear is that the assumption didn't quite survive contact with where penetrator technology has actually gone in the meantime. So here's where the new weapon comes in, and here's why it's such a fundamentally different problem for Iran to deal with. This is a deep penetrator munition in the 5,000-pound class, purpose-built with one job: get through rock and heavily reinforced concrete without breaking apart or detonating prematurely, and only go off once it's actually reached the target space deep inside. That sounds simple when you say it fast, but it's an extraordinarily difficult engineering problem. You're talking about a warhead casing that has to survive an impact velocity that would shatter most conventional bomb bodies, while carrying a fuse sophisticated enough to count layers, sense when it's actually passed through the outer structure and reached open interior space, and then trigger the detonation at exactly the right moment instead of a fraction of a second too early or too late. Get that timing wrong, and you've either wasted an extremely expensive weapon on a shallow surface detonation, or worse, the weapon fails to detonate at all. What makes this particular weapon notable is the flexibility built into its guidance package. It can be flown as a straightforward GPS-guided weapon using pre-planned coordinates entered before the aircraft even takes off, which works fine against a fixed, well-mapped target. But it also supports real-time laser designation, meaning a weapons officer in the cockpit can actually guide the weapon onto a target and adjust that guidance mid-flight if something changes. If the laser loses track for a moment because of an aircraft maneuver, or if a threat forces a last-second course correction, the weapon is built to fall back on the last known coordinate from that laser designation, rather than just going stupid and missing entirely. That kind of redundancy matters enormously against a target set that's had years to build in decoys, camouflage, and multiple entry points specifically designed to confuse exactly this kind of targeting. And that's really the tactical reality of what a strike like this actually requires on the front end, before any bomb ever gets dropped. This isn't a weapon you can just point at a mountain and fire blindly. Someone had to identify through overhead imagery and other intelligence gathering which specific point in that mountain actually corresponds to a load-bearing structural void deep enough to matter. Not just an entrance, not just a support building on the surface, but the actual assembly or storage space buried far enough down that hitting anywhere else wouldn't accomplish anything. That's the kind of targeting work that takes real time, real expertise, and genuinely good intelligence. And it's a big part of why strikes like this don't happen every single day. When you see this weapon deployed, you're not just watching an explosion. You're watching the output of a very long, very careful intelligence process finally getting executed. And that's really the tactical reality of what a strike like this actually requires on the front end, before any bomb ever gets dropped. This isn't a weapon you can just point at a mountain and fire blindly. Someone had to identify, through overhead imagery and other intelligence gathering, which specific point in that mountain actually corresponds to a load-bearing structural void deep enough to matter. Not just an entrance, not just a support building on the surface, but the actual assembly or storage space buried far enough down that hitting anywhere else wouldn't accomplish anything. That's the kind of targeting work that takes real time, real expertise, and genuinely good intelligence. And it's a big part of why strikes like this don't happen every single day. When you see this weapon deployed, you're not just watching an explosion. You're watching the output of a very long, very careful intelligence process finally getting executed. There's a cat and mouse element to this too that's worth understanding, because Iran hasn't been passively waiting around for this exact problem to catch up with it. Reports and imagery over the years have suggested an active pattern of decoy construction, building additional tunnel entrances and support structures that look, from overhead imagery alone, functionally identical to genuine high-value facilities, specifically to waste an adversary's limited stock of extremely expensive penetrator munitions on empty or low-value targets. That's a rational response if you assume your opponent has more munitions than intelligence, and for a while it was probably a reasonably effective one. But it only works as long as the targeting side can't reliably distinguish between a real facility and a decoy before committing a weapon to it, and every strike, successful or not, generates more data that sharpens that distinction for next time. The fact that this particular strike produced the kind of extended secondary explosion signature associated with a genuine hit rather than a wasted strike on a decoy suggests that distinction has gotten considerably sharper over the course of this conflict. So let's talk about what actually happened this time around, because the footage is genuinely something else. What you're looking at is a strike against a mountain complex in a region that's already absorbed close to 20 separate bunker buster strikes across this broader conflict, which tells you something important right off the bat. This facility has already been hit repeatedly, and missiles have reportedly still been coming out of it afterward. That's the exact scenario this weapon is designed to finally close out. The strike itself produced not just a single detonation, but a rolling series of secondary explosions that kept going well after the initial impact, which is usually a strong indicator that the weapon actually reached stored ordnance or fuel deep inside the facility, rather than just cratering the surface. When a strike produces that kind of extended secondary explosion pattern, that's typically the signature of a weapon working exactly as designed, punching through to something genuinely volatile stored deep inside, rather than just making an impressive-looking hole in a hillside. Let's put some context around the broader location too, because it's not incidental that this kind of facility sits where it does. The area south of Isfahan has functioned for years as one of the central hubs of Iran's missile production and assembly ecosystem. Not a single storage site, but closer to an entire manufacturing and storage complex built into the terrain across a wide area, deliberately positioned inland and away from easy coastal targeting. That positioning was a deliberate strategic choice going back decades, on the theory that anything built far enough inland, deep enough into mountainous terrain, would simply be beyond the practical reach of a conventional bombing campaign. What this strike demonstrates is that assumption no longer holds. Distance from the coast doesn't provide the protection it used to when the weapon in question doesn't care how deep you've buried the target, only whether the fuse can survive long enough to reach it. There's a broader implication here that I think gets lost. If you're only looking at individual strike footage without connecting it to the bigger picture, and it's this: Iran's entire ballistic missile strategy has always rested on a fairly simple assumption, that even if individual launchers or forward-deployed missiles get destroyed in a conflict, the deep production and storage infrastructure would survive, and allow the program to reconstitute itself once hostilities cool down. That's the actual long-term threat, more than any single missile currently sitting in a silo somewhere. A country that can rebuild its stockpile within months of a conflict ending hasn't really been disarmed, it's just been temporarily inconvenienced. What a weapon like this specifically threatens. is that entire reconstitution timeline. If the production facilities themselves are getting reached and destroyed, rather than just the finished missiles sitting on launchers, that's a fundamentally different, much more durable kind of degradation. Let's talk for a second about why this particular capability didn't exist a generation ago, because it's a genuinely interesting engineering story on its own. Older generation bunker busters relied primarily on kinetic energy and hardened casings. Basically, build the bomb as tough and heavy as possible and let sheer mass and velocity do the penetrating work. That approach has real physical limits, because there's only so much reinforcement you can add to a bomb casing before the weight and drag start compromising the aircraft's ability to actually carry and deliver it accurately. The newer generation of these weapons solves the problem differently, combining advanced metallurgy in the casing with much more sophisticated internal fusing that can actually sense the material it's passing through in real time and adjust detonation timing accordingly, rather than relying on a simple fixed delay timer that has to guess in advance how deep the target actually sits. That's a meaningfully different and more capable approach, and it's part of why facilities that survived multiple strikes from older generation weapons are suddenly vulnerable in a way they weren't before. There's also a delivery logistics story here that doesn't get enough credit, because a weapon is only as useful as the platforms that can actually carry it into theater on a usable timeline. The heaviest deep-penetrator munitions in the broader inventory have historically required specific long-range bomber platforms to carry at all, which means getting one on target could require flying an aircraft a genuinely long distance from wherever it's based, adding hours of transit time before a single bomb ever gets dropped. What makes this particular weapon class notable is that it's sized to be carried by fighter aircraft already forward deployed in the region, meaning a strike package doesn't need to wait for a long-range bomber to fly in from halfway around the world. It can be assembled from aircraft that are already sitting on a nearby base or carrier deck, cutting the time between a decision to strike and bombs actually landing on target from potentially most of a day down to something closer to an hour. That compression in response time matters enormously in a fast-moving conflict like this one, where the operational tempo has been shifting from days between engagements down to hours. Now, here's where I want to bring in the supply chain conversation again, because it connects directly to this weapon system specifically, maybe more than any other munition currently in the American inventory. The casing on a weapon like this depends heavily on extremely dense, extremely hard materials to survive that impact and penetration process without shattering. And tungsten sits right at the center of that requirement. It's one of the hardest naturally occurring metals available, with a density that makes it uniquely suited to this exact application. You genuinely cannot build an effective deep penetrator warhead casing without a reliable supply of it. Which brings us back to the uncomfortable reality that the U.S. mostly stopped mining tungsten domestically years ago, meaning the entire supply chain for this exact weapon has been running through international sources that aren't fully within American control. That's not a hypothetical vulnerability. That's a direct input constraint on the specific weapon system we're talking about tonight. Washington has clearly woken up to this, with real federal investment now going into restarting domestic tungsten production, and that's exactly why I want to flag Vault Strategic Mining to you again. Trading under Knox in Canada and KNXF here in the US, they're building what's shaping up to be one of the more serious domestic tungsten portfolios in North America, anchored by a flagship project in Nevada on ground that was actually worked under a defense minerals contract during World War II, with current reserve estimates putting the value in the tens of billions of dollars at today's prices. When a weapon this strategically important depends this directly on a material the country has to actively rebuild domestic capacity for, companies sitting on serious verified reserves become genuinely relevant to the broader defense conversation, not just a mining story. Links in the description if you want to dig into it, and thanks again to Vault for supporting tonight's video. All right, back to the strategic picture, because I want to walk through why this specific strike matters beyond just the immediate tactical damage. Here's the thing about deterrence built on hidden infrastructure. It only works as long as the infrastructure stays hidden and stays effectively invulnerable. The moment either of those conditions breaks, the entire strategic calculation underneath it collapses, because the whole point of burying your capability that deep was to guarantee it survives no matter what happens on the surface. Once a weapon exists that can reliably reach that depth, every dollar and every year of construction that went into building those facilities stops functioning as protection and starts functioning as a very expensive, very obvious target that can't be moved. You can't relocate a mountain. Once the location is known and the weapon exists to reach inside it, the facility's entire value proposition, permanence and survivability, turns into a liability instead. And that's genuinely a different category of problem for Iran than losing individual missiles or launchers on the surface. Surface assets can be dispersed, hidden, moved between strikes, replaced relatively quickly if the underlying production capacity still exists. Losing the actual deep production and storage infrastructure is a much slower, much harder thing to recover from, because rebuilding that kind of hardened facility from scratch takes years, not weeks, and it has to be done under active observation from exactly the kind of intelligence and targeting apparatus that found the first facility in the first place. So every time one of these deep strikes lands successfully, it's not just removing today's missile stockpile from the equation, it's pushing back the timeline for Iran's entire missile program by a meaningfully longer stretch than a strike against surface targets ever could. There's a useful historical comparison here too, if you look at how other countries have approached this same basic problem of hardened, deeply buried strategic infrastructure over the decades. In essentially every prior case where an advanced military has managed to develop a reliable capability to reach genuinely deep, hardened targets, the country on the receiving end has faced the same fundamental choice: invest enormous additional resources into digging even deeper and hardening further, accept the vulnerability and shift toward a dispersed, harder-to-target model instead, or come to the negotiating table, because the underlying strategic asset that justified continued resistance no longer provides the security it used to. Digging deeper has diminishing returns fairly quickly, both because there are real geological limits to how deep you can practically build usable production infrastructure, and because penetrator technology tends to keep pace with depth increases over time, rather than falling permanently behind. Dispersal solves the depth problem but creates a different one, because a larger number of smaller, more distributed facilities is inherently harder to fully protect, and easier to eventually locate piece by piece through sustained intelligence pressure. Neither adaptation is free, and neither one restores the original level of confidence the centralized, deep bunker model was designed to provide. Let's do the roundup, because there's a story here that ties directly into the broader theme of new capabilities, reshaping how this conflict actually gets fought. There's been growing legislative movement towards standing up a dedicated combatant command specifically focused on robotics and autonomous systems, drones, unmanned surface vessels, and the broader category of AI-assisted battlefield tools that have been quietly becoming a much bigger part of day-to-day operations than most people realize. This isn't a hypothetical future capability either. There have already been real-world instances in this exact theater of small unmanned surface vessels being used for search, rescue, and reconnaissance roles that would have required much larger, more expensive, and more dangerous crewed missions even a few years ago. Put that trend together with the deep penetrator story we just walked through, and you start to see the actual shape of where this kind of warfare is heading. A combination of extremely precise, purpose-built munitions solving very specific hardened target problems, layered together with an expanding autonomous and unmanned toolkit handling the reconnaissance, search, and lower risk operational roles that used to require full crewed missions. That's not a small shift, and that's a genuinely different operating model than what most people still picture when they think about modern warfare, and it's developing faster than the public conversation around it has caught up to. There's also continued reporting out of the broader region about state-linked surveillance operations exploiting ordinary consumer devices. Home security cameras, and similar smart home hardware compromised and repurposed as low-cost intelligence gathering tools along military transport routes. That story keeps showing up across multiple theaters of conflict right now, which tells you it's becoming a standard, repeatable part of the modern playbook, rather than an isolated incident. If you've got any kind of internet-connected camera at home running factory default credentials, tonight's a genuinely good night to go change that password, because this specific vulnerability keeps getting exploited in exactly this way, repeatedly, across multiple current conflicts. It's worth sitting for a second on why these two stories, precision deep strike capability on one end, cheap distributed autonomous and surveillance tools on the other, are actually the same broader trend viewed from opposite directions. Both represent a shift away from expensive, large footprint centralized capability towards something more precise, more distributed, and in a lot of cases dramatically cheaper per unit of effect achieved. A deep penetrator weapon replaces what would have previously required either accepting a target as permanently unreachable or committing to an enormously costly, risky boots-on-the-ground operation to physically access it. A $20 compromised doorbell camera replaces what used to require a dedicated satellite pass or a human intelligence asset physically present in the area. Different scales, same underlying pattern, technology closing gaps that used to require either enormous expense or acceptance of a permanent blind spot. That pattern isn't unique to this conflict, but this conflict is turning into one of the clearer real-world demonstrations of how fast it's actually moving. All right, let's move into the strategic read, because I think this weapon system, more than almost anything else we've covered in this conflict so far, tells you something real about where the endgame actually sits. Iran's entire negotiating posture over the last several months has depended heavily on the assumption that its deep missile infrastructure represents a kind of permanent insurance policy, that no matter what gets destroyed on the surface, no matter how much pressure gets applied through the strait or through sanctions, The ability to eventually rebuild a credible missile threat would always survive underground, waiting for the right political moment to reconstitute. What this strike, and the pattern of strikes like it, actually demonstrates is that the insurance policy has a hole in it now, and it's a hole that gets more expensive and more painful to patch every time this particular weapon gets used again. That changes the actual math sitting behind Iran's decision-making in ways that go well beyond this one facility. If leadership can no longer count on deep infrastructure surviving indefinitely, regardless of what happens on the surface, the entire long-term strategic logic of continuing to escalate rather than negotiate starts to look a lot weaker than it did even a month ago. You can absorb losing surface assets and rebuild relatively quickly. You cannot easily absorb losing the deep infrastructure that was supposed to make surface losses irrelevant in the first place. That's a genuinely different kind of pressure than anything applied earlier in this conflict. And I think it's the piece that's most likely to actually shift the calculus in Tehran over the coming weeks, more than any single night of coastal strikes or any single diplomatic statement. So here's my honest read on where this goes. I don't think this particular weapon gets used constantly. It's expensive, the targeting requirements are demanding, and there's clearly a finite, carefully managed inventory being applied selectively against the highest value facilities, rather than being sprayed indiscriminately. But every additional use sends the same signal louder. The deep infrastructure that Iran spent decades and enormous resources building specifically to be untouchable is no longer untouchable. And that signal alone does a huge amount of strategic work even between individual strikes. What I'd actually watch for going forward is whether we start seeing any indication of Iran attempting to disperse or further conceal its remaining deep infrastructure in response to this, new construction activity in previously undeveloped areas, attempts to build multiple smaller, more distributed facilities, rather than concentrating everything in a small number of large complexes. That would be the logical adaptation to this specific threat. And if it starts showing up in available imagery over the coming months, that's a pretty strong signal that Iran itself recognizes the old model of deep, centralized, permanent infrastructure no longer provides the security it used to. That's the breakdown for tonight. Genuinely one of the more consequential single-weapon stories in this entire conflict, even if it doesn't generate the same raw footage volume as a big multi-target coastal strike night. Let me know what you think. Do you think this specific capability ends up being the thing that actually forces a real negotiated outcome? Or does Iran just adapt and keep pushing regardless? Drop your take in the comments. If you want to stay on top of how this develops, subscribe and keep notifications on, because I'll be back the moment there's another meaningful update. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.